Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I think in her contribution there, Joanne Lamont said something very important indeed, which I would want to anchor my remarks on, and that is start with the individual. The Government, in its response to the committee's report, says the report usefully acknowledges the responsibility of citizens, public services and the Scottish Government in taking action forward. And of course, that is pretty much self-evident. I'm going to say one or two things about perhaps the approach the committee has taken. But before I do that, let me say, this being the very first parliamentary report on this kind of subject, we have no point of comparison to make with other predecessor reports. It clearly is an excellent piece of work. It is thorough in its scope, its analysis and in its drawing conclusions. But for next time, there are one or two things we might think of doing. Looking at those who provided evidence to the committee, yes, of course.
Mr Stevenson, when does he think the next time will occur?
Stewart Stevenson.
As Winston Churchill and others said, predicting the future is particularly difficult, so I will not try to do that. That's a matter for committees. But quite seriously, I think what we have is in many ways a first-class report, but let's look at who gave evidence. Of the written evidence that was given, only 10%, slightly under 10%, came from individuals. And of the oral evidence that was taken by the committee, every single person who appeared in front of the committee represented somebody, had a job title. Now, in going out and engaging communities, I absolutely recognise the committee talked to what I might almost patronisingly, but not intended to be, talk to real people. And it is always a fundamental challenge for us in Parliament and in committees to actually get beyond the institutions and talk to the people who are involved. And I want to just talk a little bit about that. Looking at the 13 recommendations the committee has made, the word people only occurs twice. It occurs properly where it occurs. I'll come back to you if I may. Because I want to just develop the point a little bit, that the Scottish Government should identify the typical profile of people who are at risk, and I think that's entirely right. And the very last thing talks about technology and people. Now, the reason I anchor it on people is I'm one of the older participants in the debate. I will be 70 later this year. And I see a number of my friends perhaps from quite a long time ago, who are now affected by the very issues of this report, and how perhaps this report, which is great, it will equip the corporate Scotland, the third sector, the government, the councils, to respond to the problem even better. But I'm not sure that it perhaps goes to the point of empowering individuals who have no status other than being, for example, the friend of someone whose mental capacity is now diminishing. One of the things that is absolutely necessary when you're interacting with someone who is still able to communicate but is suffering from the early stages of dementia is how to interact, how to give them something out of that experience if you're visiting them. And I have a small circle of friends who have some degree of mental incapacity whom I visit. And one of the key things, for example, to do is always to talk about things that happened 30 and 40 years ago, because generally that memory will endure in the way that short-term memory is almost the first part to decay. So I think we need to be sure that in our responses we're equipping people. I'm privileged because I come from a medical background, my father and so on, perhaps to have this understanding. Others may not, and I think we should look at doing some of that thing. Now, I did intervene on a previous speaker on the matter of isolation versus social isolation versus being alone. And I think people find it more difficult to make friends as they get older. It's easier to keep or refresh the friends that you have. One of the ways of doing that, of course, is technology. And some of the technologies can be quite good and old technologies. This year, I took the decision I wouldn't send Christmas cards. I instead sent letters, and each letter was personalised. And I found quite a few people of my age whom I've been sending Christmas cards, and we've been exchanging Christmas cards for the last 25 years without necessarily meeting. And it was a pretty purposeless interaction, to be blunt. And I've been amazed at how I've suddenly got responses by writing just a couple of sentences on the back of a sort of circular letter. So I think there are things we as individuals can be doing, and as corporate Scotland, we can be helping others to understand these sort of things that we could be doing. And of course, as our mental faculties decline too, and our memory is becoming less effective, we need to also focus on the people who are the partners of these people, because they're socially isolated in their own homes. They're often finding it difficult to live with all the time the person that they've been married to or lived with for decades, and that person also needs support. And I think that's, again, another thing we might look at.
Could you draw to a close,
social
please?
Interaction. I've previously talked about reducing taxation on bingo. I make a further plea to the government that we do that, because there is medical evidence that bingo is one of the ways of keeping people mentally alert. And finally, Presiding Officer, in rural Aberdeenshire, and I believe in Dumfries and Galloway as well, we have a particular problem in getting high-speed broadband to individual homes, because the technology that phones use to connect to exchanges, which is called exchange-only lines, much bigger proportion of homes that cannot get connected to fibre directly by the technologies being used. Perhaps social inclusion, using Skype, being connected electronically is something that would help. It's another little thing. Excellent report. Commend the committee again. But next time, we'll perhaps move on to look at individuals rather than the corporate response. Presiding Officer.